15 years. That is the length of time the United States is prepared to stake its credibility, military power, and diplomatic influence on Ukraine's survival as an independent state. At first glance, that number may sound arbitrary. In reality, it may represent one of the most consequential security commitments made in Europe since the collapse of the Soviet Union. If implemented, it could redefine the continent's balance of power, reshape political boundaries, and determine whether the war in Ukraine ends or merely pauses before erupting again. Public attention has focused on familiar images, leaders shaking hands, brief statements to the press, and carefully managed diplomatic optimism. Yet far from the cameras, a complex and highly sensitive document has been circulating between Washington, Kyiv, and Moscow. This unfinished and fiercely contested framework could fundamentally alter Europe's security architecture. With each passing day, the margin for agreement appears to be shrinking. On Sunday, December 1, President Donald Trump hosted Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy at his Mar-a-Lago residence in Florida. The meeting lasted nearly 3 hours, an unusually long session for talks officially described as exploratory. When Zelenskyy emerged, his message was unmistakable. Something significant had shifted behind closed doors. For the first time publicly, Zelenskyy confirmed that the United States had offered Ukraine security, guarantees lasting several years as part of a broader peace proposal. These guarantees, he said, would define how a future agreement would be monitored and enforced and would include the presence of partners. That phrase, deliberately vague, immediately raised concerns among diplomats and analysts. Russia has long been explicit in its position. It will not accept NATO troops on Ukrainian soil in any form. Even symbolic deployments are viewed in Moscow as a direct threat. What made Zelenskyy's announcement even more revealing was what followed. Ukraine had not initially asked for several years of protection. It had asked for half a century of guarantees, Kyiv argued, was necessary to prevent future Russian aggression. Ukraine's position is rooted in history. It surrendered the world's third largest nuclear arsenal in exchange for security assurances under the Budapest Memorandum. Those assurances proved ineffective when Russia annexed Crimea in launched a full-scale invasion in Artsakh. From Ukraine's perspective, guarantees without enforcement are not merely weak, they are dangerous. The fact that Ukraine is now openly discussing a several-year framework suggests major compromises are already underway. But compromise does not mean red. At the heart of the negotiations lies a peace framework that Zelenskyy claims is agreed upon. That remaining % contains the most volatile issues, those capable of collapsing the entire process overnight. Under the proposed framework, Ukraine would be permitted to maintain a peacetime military force of land troops. This figure represents a significant concession by the United States, which initially sought to limit Ukraine's forces to Lopad. Kyiv argued that anything less would leave the country exposed to renewed attack. In exchange, the United States, NATO, and European partners would provide security guarantees modeled closely on NATO's Article, the principle that an attack on one is an attack on all. If Russia were to invade Ukraine after the agreement, a coordinated military response would be triggered, and all international sanctions against Moscow would be reinstated. However, these guarantees would be if Ukraine were to launch an unprovoked attack on Russian territory, the guarantees would become void. The intent is deterrence without escalation, though critics warn that interpretation of provocation could become a future flashpoint. One of the more unusual elements of the proposal is the creation of a peace council to oversee compliance. This body would include representatives from Ukraine, Russia, the United States, NATO, and European countries, and it would be chaired by President Trump himself. Supporters argue this ensures high-level U.S. engagement. Critics warn it places too much authority in the hands of one individual and risks politicizing enforcement decisions. The entire framework depends on a ceasefire, and this is where negotiations enter a nearly impossible loop. Ukraine's constitution requires a national referendum for any territorial concessions. Zelenskyy has stated that such a referendum would require at least Lichter's days of ceasefire to allow for campaigning, voting, and verification. Russia, however, has categorically rejected any temporary ceasefire. President Vladimir Putin has insisted that fighting will stop only after a complete settlement is finalized. The result is a deadlock. Ukraine needs a ceasefire to finalize a deal, while Russia refuses a ceasefire without a finalized deal. Now here is this impasse more visible than in the Donbas region. Russia currently controls nearly all of Luhansk and about 10% of Donetsk. Moscow's demand is straightforward and uncompromising. Ukraine must withdraw entirely from the Donbas, including areas Russian forces have not been able to capture. Ukraine's response is equally firm. Zelenskyy has repeatedly stated that Kyiv will not surrender territory its soldiers continue to defend. President Trump acknowledged the difficulty of this issue publicly, noting that some land has been taken and some remains up for grabs. Behind the scenes, U.S. negotiators have explored ideas such as demilitarized zones, frozen front lines, or free economic regions monitored by international forces. Each proposal encounters the same obstacles, constitutional barriers in Ukraine, and strategic objections from Russia. And equally dangerous, if not more so, is the question of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. The facility is the largest in Europe and once generated roughly 80% of Ukraine's electricity. Today, it sits in occupied territory near active front lines, no longer producing power and dependent on external electricity to prevent a nuclear accident. The International Atomic Energy Agency has maintained a monitoring mission at the site, but Russian authorities have repeatedly restricted access. The U.S. proposal suggested joint control of the plant by Ukraine, Russia, and the United States. Ukraine rejected the idea outright, proposing instead joint U.S.-Ukrainian management with no Russian involvement. Complicating matters further is the destruction of the Kakhovka Dam in Arsen-Lingar-sur-San, which supplied water necessary to cool the reactors. Since then, water levels have dropped significantly, raising doubts about whether the plant can ever fully resume operations. Experts estimate it could take 5 to 7 years simply to assess and repair the damage. While just as negotiations appeared to be gaining momentum, events took a dramatic turn. On Monday morning, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov claimed Ukraine had launched Josary long-range drones targeting President Putin's Valdaldai residence. According to Russian officials, all drones were intercepted and caused no damage. Lavrov then announced Russia would revise its negotiating position as a result. Ukraine immediately denied the allegation, calling it a fabrication designed to justify retaliation and derail peace talks. President Trump confirmed that Putin had personally told him about the incident. When asked whether U.S. intelligence had verified the claim, Trump said it was still unclear and acknowledged the possibility that the attack may not have happened. The numbers raise questions. Russia's own defense ministry reported fewer drones and fewer in the claimed region, and Geofrang, fueling speculation among analysts that the incident could have been exaggerated or fabricated. Regardless of the truth, the diplomatic impact was immediate. Russia announced it had already selected targets for retaliation, while Ukraine warned that Kyiv could once again be struck just days after massive missile and drone attacks left parts of the capital without heat during freezing temperatures. Mendier's uncertainty deepens. Europe is preparing for multiple outcomes. Early January, a coalition of censure countries led by France and the United Kingdom is set to meet in Paris to finalize security commitments for Ukraine. These include continued military support, reassurance forces, and U.S.-backed guarantees resembling NATO's Article Wu. The European Union has also approved a Chaucer billion loan package for Ukraine to be repaid using frozen Russian assets once reparations are secured. 100 experts now see 3 possible paths forward. A deal could be reached within weeks, activating the security framework and initiating a ceasefire. Negotiations could drag on for months, allowing both sides to reposition militarily. Or talks could collapse entirely, leaving the war to continue indefinitely. The real question is not whether Ukraine receives Sir War years or Worcester's years of security guarantees. The real question is whether any guarantee can deter Russia from actions it has taken repeatedly since Arsen-Lingar-sur-San. Zelenskyy wants enforcement, not promises. Putin continues to test limits, and Trump has positioned himself as the deal-maker who can bridge gaps others could not. In the coming weeks, Europe's future may be decided not on the battlefield, but in negotiation rooms where Every claim, every denial, and every compromise could determine whether peace holds or merely postpones the next crisis.